What would be really nice if you could just go around and introduce yourself, if you don't mind. You don't have to if you don't want to. If you can, it would be really nice. Lindsay, can we start with you?
My name is Lindsay Rehman. I want to say that out. Nice to be here.
It'd be good to know what area you work in as well.
Yeah, remember that chapter is
I'm at Cherry Forest Hospital, just down the road from here, and that's my teacher. I'm Kelly Morrison from Coventry, from Warwickshire, University Hospital. You always say University, do you? I don't want to know that is. Okay, Coventry, University Hospital, and I'm the lead baby loss
Coventry.
James Thompson, I'm one of the chaplains at Hinchinbrook Hospital, medium-sized acute hospital.
I'm Sarah Crane, head of chaplaincy at Milton Keynes Hospital and our local hospice.
And I'm John Mills, chaplain at Derriford Hospital in Plymouth.
From Chiswick, and I'm the chaplain acute trust Sheffield.
Shazad, also chaplain at Sheffield.
I'm Jane Beach, I'm the lead professional officer with Unite previously, well, still am a nurse, still on the register, still doing a little bit of vaccinating. I support you as the college and here to learn and listen.
I'm Derek Eubank, chaplain with the Country Mental Health Managers Trust.
I'm Keith Johnson, and I work with the same Mental Health Trust in the country.
I'm Philip Staves, I'm retired. I'm very pleased to be retired. I'm treasurer of the college, that's why I'm here. When I was working, I was 17 years a chaplain, and I retired as lead chaplain at Kettering in Northamptonshire, Kettering General Hospital in Newcastle.
I'm also looking forward to retiring. So, the topic we've got today is I'm chaplain with you. So, just a bit of background of what I wanted to focus on over the last few years. Well, prior to COVID, I've been chaplain 15 years, and I've had some very interesting encounters going on the ward, and people thinking either I'm a relative or I'm somebody else because I happen to be the same colour as the person I'm sat with. So I think, oh, are you a relative? Or I'm the interpreter, can you interpret something for us, please? And I thought, oh, okay, please read my manual, I'm a chaplain. So I just want to give you a bit of background of some of the cultural complex things that tend to go on within the workforce for patients as well as staff as well. Oh, sorry, I'll give you a So I'd just like to go through the PowerPoint first, and then we're going to have a look at the case studies, and it'll be really good to have your input and just to be able to share this. By the way, I'm not going to talk at you for an hour and a half. I think you've seen it with me. But it'd be just really nice to be able to share as a team some of your reflections and just some of your own experiences as well. Okay. So obviously the objectives and outcomes of this session is just to look at the way that ethnic minority individuals experience some of the additional barriers in accessing quality end-of-life care. So that's one of the things that I've been focusing on over the last few years. And I kind of fallen into it. It's not something that I went out to do, but I was the one that was possibly, what do you think about this? What changes do we need to make here? And just to expand our understanding around different religious and cultural understandings of death and dying, and not just religious people who have a different belief system. and just look at that a little bit more. And what can we do to address these barriers? It's not always easy, that's what I'm going to say. And I think there's always an assumption of what people want. But I think sometimes when we become too confident in what we're doing, we think we know it all. But we don't always. It's always about asking the other. So how do people react to bereavement? People's reaction to end-of-life care are influenced by different things. So it could be their ethnicity or their religious traditions. Also things around life after death. So what happens right at the end can be crucial for that person when it comes to the passing over, and what does that contribute towards once somebody has passed. And the type of relationships ended by death. So your relatives, your friends, your colleagues, what does that mean to one person? Sometimes the cause of death, that can be really significant to how the people respond afterwards. The way somebody has died, that could have a different impact to different people in how, whether it was a suicide or it was a sudden death or it was end of life and they were told that they had 6 months. And obviously the person's age at death. If it's a child, the bereavement might be slightly different. If it's an adult, slightly different. And if it's a parent who's lost a child, there's lots of talk around, oh, this is not how it's supposed to work. I'm supposed to go before my child. Okay. So we're going to look at the case studies a little bit later. But what I wanted to just talk a little bit about is at the end of the PowerPoint, about what are the barriers and how do we address them. So what should we be doing? We should be trying to understand our patients, different cultural backgrounds, spiritual and religious understandings of death and dying. Have these needs of our patients been met? That is a key thing. Have we done everything that we could possibly do to make the needs, to ensure that the needs of our patients have been met? And sometimes there's a complexity in language in medicine. So you get a doctor come and tell you, give you some news, and you look at them and you think, what did you just say? I didn't get a word of that. So it's about speaking the language of our patients, and that, I don't mean in terms of language, it's different language. It's about speaking at them at their level. The whole medical terminology can be thrown sometimes. And include relevant people in the conversation very early on, so whether it's interpreters or if it's a chaplain who's just trying to help them understand where they are. Sometimes the decision making may need family involvement. Sometimes it may not. Sometimes it can be very difficult when you get the family involved because the patient might want something completely different to what the family want. So it's about gauging with the patient what their needs are and what their wants are. Good communication, how much they actually understand, how much of that are they grasping. And what absolutely baffles me is when you're on a ward and the patient doesn't have the language intended to speak a completely different language, and the member of staff feels by shouting louder they are going to understand them. And that's not you're supposed to be quite highly intelligent. So how can you get that wrong? It doesn't mean if you're going to shout louder, they're going to understand you. And not to make assumptions about patients' belief systems. One size does not fit all. It's really interesting when I'm on the ward and I've done some teaching with the staff, and they'll say to you, oh, can we have a list that we can tick off? I'm like, no, you can't. You need to ask the patient. Not every Muslim is the same. I'm not the same as Shazad. My wants and needs might be different to what Shazad saw and vice versa. So again, ask the patient, see what they would like and what their needs are. Okay, so first I'm just going to go through a couple of the shorter case studies and then we will move on to the longer one. So sorry that I didn't realise how small it is. You might need to magnify glass. Okay, so this patient is one of my patients who came to me a few years ago, and they were told that they've got heart failure. So they had one admission and they had a second admission. So during the second admission, going back telling the story how prior to that they were told that they had heart failure, and the GP had discussed the DNAR with the patient out in the community, and the family and the patient no chance, not having that. We don't want to discuss a DNAR. There's a fear factor of what does that mean? We don't know what it is. Or does that mean you're not going to treat our loved one? You take them to, if something happens in the community, you're going to kill them off. I've heard that quite a bit. Yeah. Patient had been cared for at home. The district nurses were involved, and the family cared for her. And family were really happy with the care that they were receiving in the community. The patient's health deteriorated, and she was admitted to hospital. So once she was admitted to hospital, the consultant had a conversation with the family, and they talked about pain management and suggested that the palliative care team should be involved. So the family actually had this conversation and said, well, if we're going to have this conversation about end of life, who are the right people? And I suggested, well, let's have a chat with the palliative care team. Interestingly, the consultant of this patient disagreed and said, well, why does the palliative care nurse need to be involved? I can tell them whatever they need to know. But it's a specialism, and the language of the palliative care team going to use is very different to what this consultant who's been caring for this patient might say and do. So after a bit of tug-of-war, we had it out with the consultant and spoke to the rest of the team. They agreed, and eventually the specialist palliative care nurse was involved with myself. And what I found really interesting in this case was the daughter had been in the hospital a couple of months before this, so the daughter of the patient who was now in across at the other side at the Hallamshire. And she suffered with a headache, she collapsed, she was having seizure after seizure, took her into hospital, she had a bleed on her brain. Thank God she came out of that. So she was now caring for her mum. And what nobody took into consideration is everything that she had just been through. And they would constantly use her as an interpreter. And whatever she'd been through, that was what it was significant. But at that time, it was insignificant. You shouldn't be using a family member as an interpreter because you don't know, or translate, you don't know what conversations are going to be had, you don't know what kind of pressures are going to be put on the patient. And secondly, to take into consideration what the wider family are also thinking. This one person is carrying all this pressure. And she may agree with the palliative care team, she may agree with the consultant that yes, we need to go down the palliative care route, but now you put them in this position, lots of disagreements amongst the family, and this one person is feeling the pressure now. So I was very keen that she wasn't used as the interpreter, and it was because it was causing conflicts in the family. The patient was in lots of pain, and initially family refused pain relief because of the experience that they had in the community. There was this conversation in the community about a syringe drive, and there was conversations about what sort of medication could be used. And what had happened, she was given a very high dosage of some medication in the community that made her very sleepy. That then made the family think, well, she's going to die very quickly, and that's not what we want. She's not eating and drinking no more because she's sleeping quite a lot. And it's very important to this family that she was awake and she was able to say her prayers. And that got their backs up a little bit when she came into the hospital. Eventually we had a conversation and we talked about pain relief and what that was for. The palliative care team were involved and I was involved, and eventually the family agreed to that. Once the pain was managed, the family understood that she was rendered life care and they decided to take her home. Now, initially there was a bit of reluctance of her going home. And I want you to think about why that might be. I'm not going to actually talk about that right now, but I think, why do you think that this family didn't want to take her home? Once she did get into the community, the palliative care team was involved. Her own GP was involved once again, and the patient passed away on the weekend. So it was quite a complex case in terms of where I sat within that. So the family, because I got to know them, I built that relationship, we had the trust, they were really keen for me to be there in all the meetings when there was meetings with the MDT team, because there was this fear about what are these people going to do to my loved one. And from a faith perspective, they had this ongoing battle about, can we go down the palliative care route? Actually, we were told by our local imam in the community, you can't do that because you're killing your loved one. No, that's not what you're doing. So there was that conflict with their belief system, with the leader that they went into the community, and then they came into the hospital, and I was saying something completely different. So we sat as a family and we discussed and we talked about whether this treatment was going to, if it was reversible, is she going to get better, is she not going to get better? And we realised that very quickly that she was actively dying. So it was really important for us to be able to make her as comfortable as possible and for her to have as good an ending as possible. So first thing I want to ask you, have you got any reflections on the case before I go back and talk about some of the complexities that happened after she passed away? Any thoughts?
I think one of the most pressing things that comes across to me is the level of misinterpretation of what's happening by the community and the intentions of the hospital. And I think that's down to simply because the community are not aware of the processes or the reasons things happen in the hospital.
I think that also has to do with, in my context, there will always be competing sources of information. So, the doctors will be saying that, but I don't think this happening.
It's for the
It's been
live
live
stream, I
streamed.
think, so that they
Oh.
for the people on the live
Yeah.
stream.
There will always be competing sources of information and there will be competing authorities.
Yeah.
In terms of the doctor says that, and I come from a culture where the doctor's voice is very, it's believed. But there's also other, and this thing that you referred to, the end of life, in my society as well, people view it as you're actually killing somebody or you're just letting them die and doing absolutely nothing about it. But the thing that really took me about that case study is the fact that they used the daughter as an interpreter. That's just not right on many levels. Even if she didn't have the prior bleed, it's just wrong. You're putting her in a very difficult position to be an interpreter for your mom who's going through this.
I think the other thing is what we forget as well. Sometimes when I know at the beginning of my journey of chaplaincy 15 years ago, I probably, a bit like Lindsay, I was a yes girl. And if somebody asked me to do something, I would have done it. And I did translate quite a lot when I was on the ward, I was interpreting. And then I thought, actually, I'm not sure to do this. So if I give some information that's not correct, as well as it's all fine and dandy and it's going okay now, but something could go very wrong very quickly, and it's not something that I should be doing because that's not part of my role. And I think it's the assumption, isn't it? It's like the consultant coming in the room with the medics and saying, just literally walking in and taking over, and you're in the middle of a deep conversation and you're thinking, and I have my lanyard on and say, oh, can you tell me so-and-so? And I'm like, I'm the chaplain. All right. And then just carry on. And it's the difficulties that come with that. It's like, when do you actually, no, it's not okay. We're in the middle of something.
I think I've identified this myself in the way I've worked over the years, is that I used to say yes all the time because I wanted to promote how useful chaplaincy could be and to get people to, basically, to put it in layman's terms, to like chaplaincy. Yeah. But actually, I think what we need to do and what I've tried to do is to grow into the confidence of who we are and what we are, and to own the space that is ours and not somebody else's, but to have confidence genuinely in what we bring and what we are there for, and that which is ours to contribute. And when we do that well and we own that space well, we don't need to pretend to be something else, I think is. But that's a journey, I think, that we've been on as a profession and as individuals.
Yeah, I think as well to
It's also to challenge those assumptions because I don't have dress
that makes me look like a chopper. Nobody reads your badge, let's be honest. So I often get confused with being the daughter, for instance, or the junior doctor, which is very specific, but the junior doctor, then people show me their wounds and everything, or I literally get scrubbed in at some point, which is very frightening because you're not good at blood. But it's indeed that boundarying off that you say it's okay to actually say no, and live here as the chaplain, even though I might speak their language, or even though I might be part of their community, whatever that might be, that it's okay to say no, and to refer to other services. You're solely there to offer that religious, spiritual, and pastoral care, that's me, rather than to spread yourself thin and to take on that risk, like you're saying too, if you're not insured. That is quite a liability, isn't it?
Absolutely. So, thank you for that. Thank you for your thoughts and your reflections on that. Just want to talk about the second shorter case here as well. So this was a patient that was referred. It was in the hospice, so a different setting to where I work. We're doing to work in the hospice as well, from on call. And this patient had been cared for at home again by the district nurses, and family cared for her, and family were pleased with the care they had received. So this patient at home was content with what was going on in the community. But one thing somebody forgot to tell them was a team, there was a lost in all the language, and who was saying what was that family didn't understand the difference between what palliative care was and the palliative care team and the district nurse team. So you had the palliative care nurses coming in, and nobody in the family realised what the difference was, because there was an assumption made that the family will know that these are the palliative care nurses and these are the district nurses. And another thing that the team hadn't picked up is because she was brown, Asian, automatically assumed that she spoke Urdu. So the person they got him to interpret was Urdu speaking, which didn't sit very well because she only spoke Bengali. So I could translate it because this was the person that had come in. So that was really tricky because they had to get the team in. There were lots of people that needed to engage in this conversation, and the interpreter turned up and started speaking to the patient, and the patient don't know what he's saying. And the family said, she doesn't speak Urdu, how come nobody asked? But it's amazing, isn't it, how you think, God, that's bonkers, how come nobody asked? But this happens quite a lot. We see this on a daily basis. People make these assumptions. And one thing that the family couldn't understand is why is this patient, their loved one, receiving, why they were providing symptom control rather than treatment. So again, well, why are you just managing the symptoms? We want to have a conversation about treatment, but again, nobody had discussed that this patient was now palliative. So that was really difficult. And because they hadn't had the conversation about end-of-life care earlier on, the dynamics that came with it then weren't met. So there were lots of things, there were lots of people coming in, and what always baffles me, this patient might have been in hospital for 6 weeks, and you are literally getting called as they're drawing their last breath. And you think, why didn't you call me before now? Why didn't you let me build that connection with this family? Why were they not referred to chaplaincy early? We're not all about death and dying. You know, we're here to journey alongside these people. So she died early morning on a Sunday, and again, that was in the community, and the funeral had to be delayed to the next day, and this caused a lot of stress for the family and health professionals. So just going back to the first case, this patient was, the family were very reluctant to take their loved one home. Have you any ideas, anybody picked up a theme here why they didn't want to take their loved one home and preferred for them to die in hospital if that was going to happen? If you have a big Muslim community within your settings, you might get the gist of why Shazad don't let the cat out of the bag, please. No? So
I was going to say something about giving up, because if you're in hospital, there's things that they're going to do for you. Maybe. I think that perhaps would be something in the community that I come from. But you know, if they're sending me away, it's because they're not interested anymore. They're not going to help me.
yeah. So there were two things here. First one is what Fran alluded to us. So when my first patient came into hospital, they built a trust with their GP out in the community, so their GP knew them really well. When they came into the hospital, every morning they'd see a different doctor. The MDT team, there was always a different person what was coming into the room. So we were having the same conversation over and over again, explaining again from the beginning, this is where we are as a family, this is what we want. And then one morning, this new face had come in again. A young doctor, looked very young, there was a bit of a language barrier as well, and said to the family, said to the patient, oh, can we go through this paperwork? Bearing in mind, again, they didn't have anybody interpreting, the family were present, one of the daughters were present, and said, should we have a chat about a DNA now? And she looked at that doctor and said, who are you? Because she hadn't introduced herself either. And we just want to know, Mrs. So-and-so, if your heart stops, what do you want us to do? But we think it's best if you X, Y, and Z, we don't do this. So she went into this big, huge panic, and the daughter was there. She was trying to reassure her. And then I noticed the doctor become quite panicked as well, because she was very new to this, she was a junior doctor, and she left her and said, I'll come back and speak to you in a while. Came out, had a chat with me, said, oh, what have I done wrong? So we then had a conversation about practice and where the family were at in their journey. And coming back to what Fran was saying, there was this whole thing about, well, if you're in hospital, there's people who can do. There's always going to be a nurse there or there's a doctor there. Whereas if I go into the community, something happens to me, my heart stops, that's it, it stops. I'm going to die, there might not be anybody with us. But the second thing was, we're very practical as Muslims in terms of what we want doing pretty quickly. So the key thing here was that if she went out into the community, which she did, if she died on a weekend, then her funeral cannot be done as quick as it would be if she was within the hospital. And the reason why that is, you may have a doctor on all the time, and you'll know this. I can see you nodding because you probably experienced it. They've literally drawn their last breath, or not, even not, and the family are discussing an MCCD and when can we do the funeral. So if you're in a hospital, you've got a nice big team of medics, you can usually get a doctor who's going to sign the death certificate. The problem that you've got if you're in the community, the GPs don't work in the community on a weekend. So from that came our work during the pandemic, where we worked very closely with the GPs in the community, and we set up a WhatsApp group of GPs who were going to be available on the weekend, because at that time you didn't have to see the patient alive to be able to issue a death certificate. As long as you could have access to the notes and you knew the cause of death, that was something that could be done pretty quickly. So there was this reluctance from the family who wanted to go home because they were worried about whether they'd be able to have the funeral on a weekend or not. So she passed away, of course, on the weekend, and everybody was up in arms about what would happen. Now, reflecting back on that, if the palliative care team were involved and had conversations with the family and then with the GP and with the out of hours team, things could have been done to facilitate. And there was a bit of an uproar on day one on the Saturday when she passed away because they called 999 and didn't call the out of hours team, so the police had got involved. But there was a process, there was a way that we could have overcome that. And then when I got involved, that's the problem, you get pulled into the community as well. We managed to get hold of a doctor who could do it on the weekend. And because I'd built that relationship with the family, they were very keen for me to be involved in the with the funeral as well, and the bathing and the washing. But one thing I'm very protective about with our patients is allowing the families to take lead in what they want. In the community, what we get, you get a group of volunteers, or you get a group of people within the mosques who like to take over. And you probably get the same in the church. We're really important. And I'm like, well, actually, it's not about you, and it's not about me, it's about the family, and it's about what their needs are. And I'm a big advocate for empowering them to be able to do things. And because they also think you're a leader in the community, or you do the washing, and I always bat it back to the family, would you like to do that? But we don't know how to. And it's just about guiding them and saying, well, I can be with you and I can guide you and we can experience it together. And it's such a profound experience. I always find that it helps in the grieving process. So that's really, really important to myself. So the next case that we're going to look at is one in detail. It's quite long. So it's a bit of a debate as we meet.
Just enlighten me here. This whole business about wanting the death certificate at the weekend.
Yeah.
Because if somebody dies on a Saturday and there's a death certificate, when would be the earliest that they could bury it?
Saturday.
Literally on Saturday?
Literally. I lost an uncle at 45. He went to play football and he literally dropped dead on the football pitch. Had an asthma attack and he died. That was Thursday evening, 9 o'clock. By 2 o'clock the next day he was buried.
Oh, that's a weekday.
That's a weekday. But even on a weekend, so that's the other thing. I'm just very proud to say at Sheffield we've got a very good system in place where we have an on-call registrar on a weekend. We have the cemetery open on a weekend. We have a coroner who's available on a weekend. But that's all through relationships and what we've built as in my work as a chaplain and what the needs are of the community. So if somebody does die at 8 o'clock in the morning, we have a team who's available. We can speak to the doctors. We will get a death certificate sent, emailed across to the registry office, and it's all done the same day.
Yes, in Sleepy Row, Northamptonshire, you know, these things just chug on.
Yeah.
So,
So,
very impressed.
yeah, but saying that, I will say, there's no point pushing your doctors to do these things if you haven't got X, Y, and Z in place.
Yes.
Just pass the mic over. Keep forgetting we've got a microphone.
Yeah, in Coventry, we have quite a large Muslim community, so it's very often when you come on call at the weekend, we look at a day, we have sort of things in place, but the registrars are only available between 10 and 12 through the day.
And of course, the day at 1 o'clock,
Yeah.
12.
So we have to be really open with families and say, as much as we want to respect your tradition and what you want to do, we also are restricted on what we can do. So we can't guarantee as much as we can do today, but we'll do it as soon as we can, so it'll be tomorrow. But like you said, it's always 1 o'clock, the person dies at 1 o'clock, and then we're trying to get the death certificate signed by an actual doctor who probably was the last person that saw them. So you spend your whole day racing now. So there are things that we need to tighten in the adult side, but the children, the baby side, we seem to have managed that quite easier.
And I think it's also about managing expectations. I think there's certain things that we won't be able to do. So you've always got the case that needs referring to the coroner. There is nothing we can do about that. It has to go to the coroner. And God will understand. That's what I always say to the families. And think practically, why would anybody want to release a body at 12 o'clock at night? Nothing is going to happen at that time. So let's be practical about things. Actually, I'm not willing on ringing my medical examiner at 1 o'clock in the morning when he's done a 12-hour shift or a 14-hour shift on a ward, because nothing is going to happen during the night. Let's take a bit of time. Let's wait till 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I think making these false promises to families as well, you'll always have the nurse who's going off at the end of her shift saying, oh, don't worry, everything will get sorted at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And they're banging on your door at 8 o'clock in the morning. And then you get the brunt of it. So it's trying to say to the nursing staff as well that we have to be realistic about what we are doing and managing people's expectations. Any other thoughts before we move on? And I think the problem is if you do set the bar that high, you're always going to get that one case where, and you think, oh Lord, yeah, we get them quite often, don't we? So this case is.
Thoughts on the first case. And then I'm more mental health, so some of the stuff you're talking about, we don't relate it to it because of pandemic. And, but in my community, there's a mix, Christian thinking and traditional thinking, and the two, when they merge, there's for instance, the whole end of life palliative. In my world, it's a no-no. Doctors are supposed to be doing everything right up until the person stops breathing. So many people from my culture, from my world, telling them about there's no hope, who's caused it. It's either an individual or cosmic causality. So we just won't accept it. So they might be hearing you saying what you're saying, but it's not registering at all. They will clutch at any help, and that's where I had a cousin who was dying of cancer, very bloated like that. So took her from hospital and took her into the bush to some witch doctor in the middle of nowhere, because as much as the doctors had given them this, and the sister to this cousin was a doctor, medical doctor, trained at the University of Zimbabwe and at the University of Cape Town. So they still took their sister out into and so there is that challenge for the doctors and the nurses and the chaplains, that there's a world that you just don't know, and unless you ask the thought leaders in that community or the elders in that community to try and get an understanding of their world, because you'll be talking, they're not hearing you at all.
And I think that's what's really important, bit nail on the head there, that understanding the community, understanding what it. And there's many times where I've been on a ward and somebody might be intubated, and they will say, I'll say, the family have asked me to see this patient, and said, yeah, but they're intubated. Yeah. The power of prayer. We talk about the power of prayer and healing, and what does that mean? And it's not always about healing as in healing that they're going to come back from it. It's a spiritual healing that we talk about. And staff used to be baffled at what do you mean by that? But until they see you in action, and during the pandemic, that was a huge thing that staff were actually looking for us to come and do that as well, because they said, we need something. And what was that something? But it's understanding the culture and the background of the people is so important. And I sit in meetings where I can see that going on, exactly that. The doctor might be telling them something and it's just going, yeah. And I'm thinking, we're not interested. You carry on what you're saying, but we believe that this is what's going to happen. And it just made me think of a patient that I was seeing very recently on the intensive care unit who was awake, and he was in the hood. He had the hood on. He was a COVID positive patient, and he was so aware of what was going on around him. And his family was sat with him, and the doctor was talking about taking off the hood and reducing the oxygen levels so that he'd become a little bit more sleepy. And he was absolutely petrified. And he said, no, I want to be awake. Now, the staff battled with this, that this is not what we would normally do. And we feel that we don't want to do this, but at the same time, it was really important to respect his wishes. He said, we feel like we can see the fear in his eyes. And he said, he was completely there, knew what was going on around him. And he said, that is my request, please don't put me to sleep. Let me be. And it was interesting because they did take off the hood and they gave him the mask, but he was on 100% oxygen. And he talked to his family, and his family talked to him, and they prayed together. And he died quite quickly, but he was aware of his surroundings, and he got to hold the hand of his family members. He got to speak to them, and they got to speak to him, and that was really important to him. And the doctor came away and said, it might not be something that we agree with, but we could see how important that was for him. And I was just so grateful that they listened to him and they allowed him to have that sense of control. And that was really, really important for me. So just looking at one of my creative reflective practice pieces, and I'm not done this with the team, so I won't bore you with this, we'll go back again. So I was called to the Children's Hospital, just a bit of background, the people who were involved in this. There was myself, there was the And there was a medical team, there was the mum, and there was a baby, and there were lots of relatives on the unit. So I received an urgent call from the charge nurse to say that this baby was very poorly and she might not survive the night. Baby was 11 months old. And I just, by the way, as I'm going through this, I just want you to put a few pointers down on reflection because I'm going to give you a bit of time as a team just to be able to discuss this. So the baby was 11 months old. The baby was in the bath at home. The mother was bathing the baby and she went away to get something. For a split second, well, for a short while, she came back to the baby who was struggling to breathe. She called for an ambulance, the baby was rushed to the hospital, and the mum was accompanying her. The mother and relatives had requested that chaplain be present to pray and to support. So these parents had 2 older children, and they'd been trying for a baby for several years. And prior to this child, baby 3, they'd actually lost a baby. They were desperately hoping, believing that S will survive. Mum requested chaplain to come and support the mother until the father had arrived. So bear in mind, he'd been away, he was abroad when this happened, and was on his way back from the airport. And what the staff were really concerned about was that, and they expressed this to different chaplains that had been on board, that the family didn't realise how seriously ill she was. So how long was my visit? 2 hours long. So I got this call again at night, asking me to come to ITU for a poorly baby. Mum might not even survive the next couple of hours. But the nurse had told me that lots of family had gathered at the hospital because she had deteriorated. And she said, oh, well, that's pretty normal, isn't it, in your culture? That's what you do. Although I've responded to many such calls over the years, it always leaves me feeling a bit anxious about how things might be when I arrive, because you never know what you're walking into. And I think that resonates with lots of us. The charge nurse talked me through what had happened and then pointed to the bay where baby S was and her family. There was also a nurse, 2 doctors present who were doing various tests on this child. The consultant very quickly introduced me to the family and asked if I could be with them, and there was a sense of relief that I could leave the room now because somebody else from their own background has come and can talk to me. I introduced myself to mum and family and just tried to gauge what was going on in the room. So as chaplains, I think we become quite skilled at looking around the room and seeing like different things, see what that's going on there, see if there's a bit of tension there, and just trying to figure out what was going on in the room. By the way, by this time, there was about 15, 20 people in the room, so I had to figure out who mum was, who everybody else was in the room. Mum was completely still holding her daughter's hand. Relatives were talking over each other and trying to reassure mum that everything was going to be okay and baby S was going to be fine. Mum was sat on a chair next to S's bed. I sat by her bedside at her level and just introduced myself. I put my hand on her shoulder and acknowledged her grief. She very quickly broke down and a huge outpour of emotions that she was feeling were released. And that was interesting because the doctor came back and said to me, she's not cried at all. That was the first time she cried when you sat with her and just kind of put your hand on her shoulder and said, I see where you are. Her relatives very quickly told her that she needed to stop that. Don't cry, don't cry. And God's going to be angry with you for expressing herself in that manner. There was this whole thing around it's the will of God. The doctor mentioned that she'd been sat wailing for some time. She was making these noises, but she wasn't actually crying. So there was lots of this, it's a cultural thing that sometimes when you hear loud wailing, and did not know how to respond to that because staff were not sure if that was part of the culture or not, is that normal? So they didn't want to offend. At that moment, Mum asked if she could speak to me alone. The relatives were very quickly escorted out to the waiting room. What the mum was really concerned about was the dad, who was on his way back, and she was worried she was going to be blamed for what had happened. She talked a lot about, I wished it had happened to me and not to my baby. This is my fault. She told me that she has faith in her God, that she holds on to that she will be there. God's going to bring her daughter home. And I sat there and I thought, oh God. And this made me feel quite anxious, and I started to think how I was going to start supporting this mum now and after She asked if I could recite some Quran, so that's the holy book to her daughter. We sat and I just recited. I just sat by her bed. I was sat on the floor because her bed was quite low, the little girl, and I just held her hand and I sat and I read some Quran to her. And the nurse said to me, sit on a chair, sit on a chair. And I thought, well, okay, you know, just wanted to get down on her level and I just sat and I read to her. So, meanwhile, her husband arrived, he came onto the ward and I was quietly snuck out of the room and I gave them a bit of time together. I went to support the relatives in the waiting room. And it was really interesting, again, I was observing the conversation, and there were lots of conversation about blame. Some were saying it's the will of God, others saying she was going to survive, others saying that she wasn't. And the one thing that I was really concerned about, that the 8-year-old child, the sibling of this baby, was in the room. And I think sometimes we forget how much children pick up and say, oh, she's just a small child, she's not understanding what we're saying. And she clearly was. I picked that up. So she was sat quietly in the corner, and I said to her, do you want to come for a walk? So I took her out of the room. We walked, she talked, she spoke about her siblings and how she was hungry. She actually said, I'm really hungry. I think in all this, still as a child, it was a lot about, you know, just, I'm hungry, just the practical things. So we went to get food, sat on a bench together, and she spoke over conversation, over having her sandwich, how worried she was. But she said something that was really, she said, if Allah decides to take her sister, then she knows that she's going to be in heaven with other children. And she said she read a book about that and she wanted to talk a little bit about that. And then she asked if we could go back to be with her parents. So when we got into the room, the daughter had met her dad and she hugged him and she spent some time with him. And then he asked if he could speak to me on his own. He said he felt he'd been given all the information and now was being told, all of a sudden he just arrived and he had been given all this information and then told that because we talked about withdrawing treatment due to significant damage to the brain, and this was the bit that really stuck with Dad. He says, well, what we can really do, if we withdraw the treatment, then she will die pretty quickly and then you can get on with the funeral. Because the staff were very aware of how. So the doctor thought it was being quite helpful, but it wasn't the right time to have that conversation. So they said, you can get on with the funeral as soon as possible the following day because the clinician speaking to family thought it was significant to do the funeral within 24 hours. And they really got the dad back home. He was really upset. He went on to say he no longer wanted to engage with that doctor or would like to speak to another member of the team. And he said it's not an easy decision to make, which obviously as a parent it isn't. And he needed to speak to his family and his own local imam, so his own mufti, who was a very senior scholar. So my thoughts at that time were that the family needed some time to absorb all the information he had been given and needed to spend some time together as a family before they could make any sort of decision. And the team were very keen to say to the family that we understand, said to the dad, that this was a tragic accident, and we really do believe that it was. Over the last few days, he had been very supportive because then a few days went afterwards and asked if he could be given some time to be with his daughter and wife without all the questions and pressure of decision making. Because every few hours that same conversation was being had again. Shall we talk about withdrawal? And he said, can you just all stop? I just want some time with my little girl. So the time came where they were then told that we need to sit and have a meeting for the MDT team. So that kind of grasped now what was going to happen next. So we went to ITU. They talked about the brainstem test that had been done and confirmed that this little girl was now brainstem dead and they wanted to withdraw treatment. So we spent some time together. Then Dad said eventually he knew what was coming. I reassured him that he would get the opportunity in the meeting to talk, ask the questions, and I said to him, write things down, because we always forget. We've got all these questions in mind, but as things go on, you forget. So he did. Went into the meeting room, the consultant leading the discussion asked the dad if he understood everything, he said, yep. And in this, I was conscious of how much conversation was being had with Mum. Lots of conversation was being had with Dad, but Mum spoke little English. But she's still important. And just because she's not got the language, we needed to put things in place to make sure that she was understanding what was going on. So they broke everything down to the T, the whole case. So I then asked Mum, again, broke probably protocol and spoke in the language of the mum and asked if she was understood everything that was going on, and she said she did. Dad was upset. He mentioned the incident that took place with the consultant and went wanting to get things done as soon as possible. The consultant who was having this meeting was a different one, and they apologised over and over again about what happened. And she didn't want to dismiss the anger and the distress at that moment and wanted to reassure him that he was heard. So the family spoke to various scholars and they were desperate. I think they just wanted somebody to tell them to carry on with the treatment. But everybody went to said, look, it would be the right thing Islamically if you chose to withdraw. It's absolutely fine. You're not going to be simple for doing that, because there was that little bit think about living with the guilt of withdrawing. So the decision was made that family could come and spend time with her, and they did. And the team decided that they were going to withdraw treatment in the evening, and parents asked if I could be there. I saw the family members there. I was with them. Mum was crying. She felt the mum opened up a little bit then. She said that she felt judged by the nursing staff, and she felt that they were all talking about her, and she heard a couple of conversations, and the staff were having there was 2 members of staff. I actually overheard this conversation, and Mum was in the room and said, who will leave a child in a bath on her own? And they thought that because Mum couldn't understand English, it was okay to have that conversation. And she picked that up. She said just because she couldn't speak English didn't mean that she didn't understand. I acknowledged that, and I said that is something I'm going to address. So the husband was also keen and spoke to the staff. So that time was spent listening to the children. They were telling stories about their sister, and we all gathered. They told some stories. We then prayed, and the consultant expressed how told them how he was going to withdraw the treatment, and he spoke to the dad and made eye contact with the dad. But again, I felt like the mum wasn't really included in this thing. Mum held her hand and withdrawal took place, and she passed away very quickly, peacefully in her mum's arms. So they spent time with her. There was this thing about they didn't want her to be taken down to the mortuary on her own, and asked, even though the medical team were going to do that, somebody was going to go with her, they asked if I could carry her down. And I thought, oh gosh, and it resonated with me so much because I have young children, and it was just so painful at that time. They prepared her, they cleaned her up, and I held her in my arms, and I remember walking in the lift and holding her very close to me. And as I walked down to the mortuary and we placed her in the mortuary, as I left, I just sobbed like a baby at that time. I was a blubbering mess. And the nursing team said to them that, everything's good, don't worry, we'll get everything sorted for the next day, and somebody will be there to speak to you, and the funeral will be able to take place. And I had to say very quickly, that's not going to happen. He's going to be referred to the coroner, because we know obviously the circumstances. So then I went away and spoke to the family and had a conversation about the process. So that's the case itself. It was a bit heavy, I know, sorry. And I just want you to speak to whoever's next to you, groups of 2 or 3, about your thoughts, your observations, your feelings, and just look at some of the points that I made there, and then we'll come back and gather and just share your observations and how maybe things could have been slightly differently. I'm quite open to fire away what things that I might have been able to do differently and better, and then we'll gather in the next 10 minutes.
But that was actually pretty good.
Yes.
I'll take that
And now you'll come waiting to tell you, yes, you've left it behind.
You've left it behind,
Like
so
fire.
Yeah,
no.
is it? I haven't got it.
I think they get a bit, narky, don't they, if they're
Mine was to stop my
Why not? It should be next bit
I
then.
don't get many wasps in my
Yeah, I thought so, because we're hitting it.
You can almost do Google Translate.
And then start to.
Are we good together?
That's fine. Don't tell me everything.
Say your prayers.
No.
Should have got this on camera. I should have got this on camera. That's on camera, like,
That's what we need to get rid of. Thank you.
any thoughts, reflections, your voice?
We were talking a bit about that judgment thing about families and how difficult that can be as a chaplain, because what you want to do as a chaplain is take people at face value and let them define themselves, so that you're not just another person coming in with all these prejudgments about them. And I was saying, we recently had a death in our neonatal unit, which was an expected death, but quite a short sense of expectation, if that makes sense. And the family did not respond as the staff wanted them to. They didn't want to be present at the withdrawal. And it really upset some of the staff, and we had to have quite difficult conversations about, actually, we're here to serve these families. If that's the decision they make, then we need to stop talking about what we think about that. It's none of our business. But also we need to know that we're here. You know, part of the reason they might be making that decision is because they trust us to be present. So So we've got to do that for them as best we can. But it's quite difficult, isn't it, when you've got a really difficult situation and then there's tension because nurse staff are kind of being guided by their own emotions. And I think as chaplains, you're often seen as the neutral person in the room, which is quite tricky. That they wanted me to hold this child while they withdrew, and I thought, that's quite a lot you're asking of me, and I don't think I can say no to that because I think that's who you need me to be, but that's going to take something later. It's a complex situation.
And I think what's interesting in that is you're not agreeing with the staff. And sometimes I feel in my situation, I'm pulled into a conversation because you're the person the family might listen to. But it's not my decision to make, we're guided by the families. So when we talk about withdrawal, it's not also being you can talk to the family, but no, it's not my decision. I will be there to support the family in whatever, it might not necessarily be the right decision for them. But if that's that decision that they've made, I've got to just journey alongside with them. I'm not going in there to convince them to withdraw treatment. That's not my job.
I think what I find difficult is when it's paediatric.
I think that's what it's about.
Sorry, carry on. I was just talking about.
Yeah, paediatric death is, and what you said about the mum handing the baby over to you. I personally have that as well, and you know, when it's an older person that's died, as much as they find it to leave that person, when it's a child, it's incredibly hard to let go, and you know, that mum looks at you as you're going to take care of my baby now as we leave, or as they hand the baby over to you, and that incredible sense of responsibility, like you were saying about when they withdrew, and that sense of holding that baby, and then I was walking down the corridor. What I found really hard was that obviously I couldn't walk through the wards carrying a baby that had died, so we have a thing called a daisy trolley, which is a disguise, so as we walk off the ward and we push this trolley, no one would know what that is. So sensitively, but not wanting the family to see that I've put the baby in this trolley, but obviously being mindful of who was around. So it really being careful of that, but that kind of overwhelming sense of giving it, and from a mother to another mother, you know, again, was so emotional. We've got a really good team in the mortuary that I'm then handing it to them, and I know that they'll look after that baby themselves, and reassuring the parents that maybe if they want to come and do a viewing, that they're being cared for by the mortuary staff. So yeah, it's really hard. So I did really resonate with that.
Yeah, that's really interesting because the whole thing around body bags, I have a big issue with, whether it's adult, children, just if that's the last thing the loved one is going to see before they're taken away, it's that image sticks with you, and a black body bag for an adult, and you just think, oh. So there's a lot to be said about families kind of leaving before that bit happens, so that they can remember them the way they'd like to remember them. But we actually take the baby down through A&E with a blanket over them, so I carried the baby. But it's obviously different in each trust, and it's being mindful of everybody else who's there. But like you said, that thing about them putting the baby in the trolley, not wanting to do it whilst the family are there. So it's that personal touch, isn't it? Again, coming back to the personal touch.
It's hard to know what's what. I had to do the same thing in my previous trust, and we had an incident where somebody had complained about the baby covered in a blanket being taken to the mortuary. So they had to be in a canvas kit, a vinyl kit bag. So I was not carrying it back. I was like kind of cradling it, but I'd much rather this wasn't a baby in a kit bag, and that made it harder. But yeah, we do these things. I was interested in some of the cultural things that you've pulled out. and reflecting on what sort of cultures do those things. And I was wondering about the wailing, and I just wonder if it's actually, it's us that are repressed and don't do it, watching the nursery in Thailand and the emotional responses of people, and emotional responses of people that you see on the news, all sorts of tragedies all around the world. And it's us British that don't do the emotional response rather than the other way around. And maybe we should be a bit more open, and we also wouldn't stand around having conversations about blame and the will of God. But actually, if you go to a Victorian cemetery and you look at the gravestones, the gravestones of anybody who died under the age of certainly 50, but probably a bit older, they pretty much all say, "Thy will be done," or what they mean is, "I don't bloody understand this, and we think it's crap, and we don't know what to say about it, so we're going to just assume that presumably there's a reason." And I think every culture has that it can't understand.
I think it's really interesting because as a Muslim in our faith background, talking about death and dying is very normal. Having an open casket is very normal. Having children is very normal. It's just seen as a transition. And now in Dying Matters there's this whole thing about using the word dying of death more than passed away, and trying to normalise it because it's something we're all going to go through. And sometimes I think children understand things really well visually. And if you take something away from them, in the sense that, well, you're never seeing your grandma again, but where have they gone? And if they can't physically see things, they can't always understand it. So my children have been there when we've had an open casket before. It's just, it's part of our culture. Sometimes I think we're protecting them, but I don't know if we are. We're not showing them.
But if you use the euphemisms as well, that creates problems in terms of, particularly with children, but not just children. We had a retired bishop in our hospital, and I discovered that people were talking to him about going home, and he was interpreting that as dying and going to heaven. He was also a confused retired bishop, and he had a bottle on his locker that I discovered was actually red wine. but which somebody obviously got it himself. But yeah, he thought when they talked to him about, you're going home soon, that they were telling him that he was about to die.
And I think this whole thing about what sometimes frustrates me when you're in a room with this family, loved ones are crying and saying, "Oh, well, it's the will of God, don't cry." But how do you get to that acceptance? They need to be able to go through the emotions and the anger and the upset, and it's a big thing to upset. It's your child, and you think, well, you don't know how that feels until you've been through it yourself. So please don't tell me how I should be feeling.
Going back to the mother in the story, it says she had limited English. And observation there is, I wondered what support was proffered to her, particularly before her husband came, because she's there, limited English, she's over here, and people say this to her. And in this context, she was the one with the baby when this happened. And so what support, if any, was given to her, and how was the support channel with, how was she, was it through the family? And these are the same family members who are saying, this is the will of Allah. And so how was that factored in? How was she supported?
And that was something I was so conscious about because I wasn't there the whole time, but when I was, and I happened to speak the same language, which was really helpful, that I could sit and listen, and she was heard, because they said she was very numb. She wouldn't really speak to anybody, but she really opened up when we had conversations. And I think it was the fact, it wasn't that I was saying anything to her, I was listening to her. Rather than saying to her, you shouldn't be feeling like this, you should be feeling like this, or this is going to be okay, I just listened. let her talk about how she felt and the guilt that she felt. And I thought that was really important, rather than talk at her, which everybody else was doing. And I think one of my observations here was that how good are we at accepting somebody complaining about us? Because the second consultant who came in and said, I'm really sorry about what happened with the first. But when I had that conversation with the first consultant, they said, well, I thought I was helping. And that was it. It was like, no, actually, maybe I shouldn't have said that. So, yeah.
I think there's also something, I think there's also something around being claimed. May that be by the family, may that be by staff, where there's lots of projections of who you should be when you're in a chaplain role. And similarly, was asked a few times that you needed to hold it, and everybody already assumed that that was your role. Without actually also checking in as a human being, are you okay by carrying this baby and we're going to withdraw life support? And I think that is kind of a theme that I've noticed within chaplaincy. You almost get dehumanized sometimes with, this is your job, just get on with it. You're the death expert. You're the person that should know how to cope and deal with it. But then there's in-between moments we were talking about as well, as you are carrying this child very close to your chest through the whole hospital, where you finally have a moment to cry to yourself when you're by yourself. That we have very limited time to actually digest what just happened. So you always have to put others' needs first, rather than that we also have our own needs and wants and emotions that we need to process and give a place. So I think, again, there is something to be said too about reminding people that we are also just human and that we can't do everything, and what impact it might have if you were to carry that child. Yeah, I think there's a strength in that.
And I think it was that thing, that assumption was just made, well, you'll be okay to do this. Actually, I might not be, but you kind of don't have a choice then, do you? You don't want to say no as well.
I was with one small child where the nurse on intensive care it was a general hospital with general intensive care, and this little boy was having his treatment withdrawal, and they had several nurses that specialised in paediatrics, and this one nurse coped all the way through, and at the end she was just distraught, and it was the thing, I knew her to be somebody that normally dealt with this okay. And basically, she had a child the same age, and they had bought clothes specially for this small child to die in. And her son had the same outfit from Amsterdam, and she'd had to dress this child in the same outfit. And to be controversial, and it's not in any way to accept or excuse what the staff said, but the staff who were saying who lets their child alone in the bathtub, it's a terrible thing to say, and to say in the hearing of the family, and absolutely. But I wonder if there's something about needing to distance ourselves. This won't happen to me and to my small child, because I would never be that stupid. I'll be stupid in some other way. But that's what they were actually saying. They didn't know that that's what they were saying, but they were trying to say, I can't imagine how this could happen to me, because I wouldn't let myself be in that situation. Because I need to be able to distance from it, otherwise I can't deal with it. I'm not making an excuse, but that's what I suggest was going on.
Yeah, because I think we make those assumptions, don't we? Like, that definitely me, I won't be that mum.
But we have to make those assumptions, otherwise
Exactly,
we can't go on.
It's like the Madam McCann situation, isn't it? You know,
Yes.
When Madam was left in the room and that happened, parents were really
Yes.
and we would all say that at that moment. I'm also thinking, as we've all talked, and you know, grief is a process, isn't it, for everybody involved. It kind of escalates almost as it in the administration, chaplain, and with staff, more staff, and everything else involved. And I love to think of the 23rd Psalm, actually, where the psalmist said, like, walking through the valley of the shadow. You know, you can't go over it, under it, or around it. You have to walk through it. And I think for all of us involved in any kind of ministry or work, to do with people and death and all that kind of stuff. It's something else to think about, isn't it, really? We've all got to go through this process. It's different for us all, different for everybody, but we all have to walk through that.
There's just one thing I want to say, that don't be afraid to journey along others that aren't from the same faith background, because there is so much commonality, and most of the journey that we take, it's like that, it's exactly the same. It's just certain rituals and certain things that we have to do, apart from that, it's just having somebody alongside you that is really key. And sometimes it's nicer to have somebody look from the outside in from a different perspective as well. I really do believe that is true.
I think that's often helpful as well, isn't it? Because if I talk to someone from exactly the same background as me, although we're all different, it's not as helpful often as if I talk to somebody whose perspective is really different. And so I think often sometimes as chaplains we're tempted to just blend with the people we're with. And actually the diversity is a gift to each other, isn't it? We benefit from that, and we're led by the person we're with, and that's positive, but we shouldn't hide away from the thing that is different, because that wisdom is a gift to us both ways, isn't it? You know?
And that's a very nice obligation to end on. I hope that was okay, everybody. Thanks for being there. Fab audience. And I think we have finished on 28 minutes past on time.